Some doors aren't locked. Yet the moment you step inside, the entire room immediately tells you one thing. You don't belong here. She was very young. Among men who carried war, loss, and years that could never be put into words, she had only a notebook and a reason strong enough to keep her from turning back. They laughed until the sound of an engine echoed from the parking lot outside, and a worn, faded patch silenced everyone. If you've ever wondered, how far must a person go to be worthy of their family's legacy, then this story should not be missed. The bar door opened with a slow creak, as if it too hesitated before allowing a stranger to step inside. A beam of afternoon light spilled into the space, thick with the scent of old leather, cigarette smoke, and spilled beer, a smell that exists only in places that have witnessed too many years to need explaining. Emma stopped for a brief moment. No one needed to tell her. She understood immediately. She had wandered into a world that was never built for her. There was no rushed noise here, only men scattered around the bar and long wooden tables, backs slightly hunched, shoulders broad, eyes slow but heavy. Leather jackets covered in faded patches, each one like a chapter of memory already closed. They didn't look at Emma with curiosity. They looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't belong. A young girl, no leather jacket, no motorcycle, just sneakers, a worn backpack, and a notebook clutched tightly to her chest. The conversations in the room gradually faded, not out of respect, but out of surprise. Then a laugh broke out, not loud, but clear enough for the entire room to hear. "Are you lost?" Another voice followed, then a few more. Half smiles, raised eyebrows filled with unspoken meaning. No one stood up. No one acted threateningly, but it was precisely that calm indifference that made people hesitate. Emma felt her heart beat faster, not from fear, but because she knew exactly this. If she stepped back now, she would never return. She took a deep breath. No explanations, no apologies. She took one more step into the center of the room. "I'm looking for the Steel Ridge Riders." This time the laughter was clearer. Someone shook his head, someone took a sip of beer as if enjoying a familiar scene. A younger man, arms covered in tattoos, leaned back in his chair, his eyes openly skeptical. "Sounds interesting," he said. "And then what?" Emma swallowed. She had prepared for this moment for a very long time, in her head, through sleepless nights, in every line of her notes. But standing in front of people who had lived through war, loss, and things that could never be fixed, every word suddenly felt fragile. "I'm a final year student," she said slowly, "and I want to follow you, to record your stories." The room fell silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then it erupted in laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes from people who have lived long enough to no longer believe in innocence. Record our stories? This isn't a museum, and it's not a classroom assignment either. Emma heard it all. She didn't argue. She just stood there, letting the doubt wash over her. Because she understood one thing very clearly. To be heard in this world, you first must prove you're brave enough to stay. And just as the laughter still hung in the air, another sound rose from the parking lot outside. Low, deep, familiar. The sound of a motorcycle engine. Just one sound, but enough to make every eye in the room turn. The engine didn't roar violently. It was low, steady, and solid, like the breathing of someone who had lived long enough to need no longer to prove who they were. That sound cut through the old walls, through the laughter that hadn't quite faded, and made nearly everyone in the bar turn their heads at the same time. There was something in that engine note that made them recognize it instantly. Not an outsider. The door opened again. The The man stepped inside without haste. He removed his gloves, hung his helmet on a familiar hook, and only then lifted his head to look around. His beard was streaked with gray. His shoulders sagged slightly as if carrying an invisible weight only he could feel. The leather jacket he wore was so old it no longer held a true black, only patches of time worn down by sun and wind. But no one looked at his face first. They looked at his back. A faded patch, its stitching frayed by years. Not flashy, not new, but enough to tell a story that everyone in this room understood. Founding member. No one spoke. The smiles from moments earlier vanished utterly, as if they had never existed. One man set his beer down on the table. Another sat up straighter. The joking disappeared, replaced by an atmosphere that only appears when the past walks into the room alongside the present. The man was Jack Walker, and Emma knew it even before she heard anyone say his name. The way people made space for him to pass. The way eyes that had been full of doubt now turned cautious. In this place, respect was not demanded, it was remembered. Jack stopped in the middle of the room. His gaze swept over familiar faces, then paused on Emma, just a beat. No surprise, no shock. As if he had known he would see her here. Emma turned to him, her voice quiet but clear. "Dad?" The word fell into the room like a heavy object, not loud, but enough to change everything. A few people inhaled sharply. Someone closed their eyes for a brief moment as if reproaching themselves for having spoken too much earlier. No one asked again. No one laughed anymore. In this world, the founder's daughter was not a title to be joked about. Jack stood beside Emma. He didn't place a hand on her shoulder, didn't shield her in any loud, obvious way, but his presence alone formed an invisible wall. It spoke every defense Emma hadn't yet had the chance to give. He looked around the room, his voice low and even. "Whatever the girl wants to say to you, let her say it." Not an order, not a plea, just a fact placed on the table. Emma felt her throat dry. She knew this moment mattered. If she leaned on her father's name, she could go further inside, but at the same time, if she didn't stand on her own now, she would forever be nothing more than Jack Walker's daughter. She took a deep breath. For the first time, the eyes in the room no longer looked at her as someone who didn't belong. They were waiting to see what she would do with the position she had just been given. And Emma understood. That patch didn't clear the way for her. It opened only one single chance, the chance to prove that she was worthy of taking the next step. Emma took another half step forward. Not because she felt more confident, but because she understood this. If she didn't speak now, she would forever remain a shadow standing behind her father. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the initial curiosity or wariness. It was an expectation. The men in front of her had lived long enough to know the difference between words spoken out of politeness and words that were truly worth hearing. Emma glanced down at the notebook in her hands. She didn't open it. Then she lifted her head. "I know. I don't look like someone who should be standing here," she said slowly, choosing each word as carefully as if one wrong syllable could make everything collapse. "And I also know you don't need another outsider coming in, taking notes, and turning your lives into a few pages of paper." Someone shifted in his chair. Another crossed his arms over his chest. "But this project," Emma continued, "isn't about motorcycles. It's not about leather jackets. And it's not about a subculture for people to be curious about and then forget." She paused for a beat, not to create drama, but to keep her voice from trembling. "It's about soldiers who come home and realize they no longer know how to live." A few eyes dropped, not out of shame, but out of recognition, seeing themselves in those words. Emma turned to look at Jack just for a second. Then she faced forward again. My dad doesn't talk much about the war, she said. He doesn't talk about the years afterward either. But I hear the nights you can't sleep. I see the way he stayed silent for years, as if he left a part of himself somewhere he could never go back to retrieve. No one in the room was smiling anymore. No one was defensive. Stories like these weren't easy to hear, but once heard, they couldn't be ignored. I see him change after every trip he takes with you, Emma continued, her voice lower. Not happier, but lighter, as if something has been set down. Jack spoke for the first time since he had walked in. His voice was rough, not from age, but from memory. After I came back from Iraq, he said, not looking at anyone in particular. Everything was too quiet. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't work. I didn't know how to be a husband or a father anymore. He paused. No one urged him on. The system said I was fine, Jack went on, but I wasn't. And the people in this room taught me how to breathe again. Not with advice, but by walking forward with me. Emma turned back to them. I didn't come here to write about heroes, she said. I came to write about people who survived and who help each other survive. There was a very subtle shift in the air. Not complete agreement, but acknowledgement. Finally, an older man slowly lifted his beer. So this girl, he said, isn't looking for a story for grades. She's looking for a story for her family. No one objected, no one voiced approval, but Emma knew. She had just crossed the first boundary, not because of her father's name, but because of the truth she dared to carry into that room. The first ride began before the sky had fully brightened. There were no formal greetings, no special instructions. Everyone put on their helmets, started their engines, and rolled out as if Emma had been there all along. She sat behind her father, her hands held on tightly, not because she was afraid of falling, but because she feared becoming a burden. The sound of the engines blended into the early morning mist, carrying a steady rhythm that slowly dissolved every unnecessary thought. Emma had imagined the ride would be like in the movies, rushing wind, freedom, and a feeling of release. But after just over an hour, reality began to take shape. Her back ached. Her wrists burned with fatigue. Every time the bike leaned into a curve, the fear of losing traction surged beneath the surface like an undercurrent. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask to stop. She clenched her teeth and endured. Because she understood now. On these roads, no one was given special treatment for who they were. 3 hours later, the group stopped at a small roadside rest stop. Emma stepped off the bike, her legs almost numb. She tried to stand straight, tried to look normal, but her body betrayed her with a faint tremor. An older woman approached and handed her a bottle of water. No questions, no comforting words, just a single sentence spoken softly. The first long ride always makes people want to quit. Emma took a sip of water, then nodded. I'll get used to it, she said, a little too quickly, as if afraid she might not believe it herself. The woman studied her for a long moment, her gaze neither judgmental nor pitying. You either do, she replied, or you don't. There's no third option here. They sat beside each other on a wooden bench. After a while, the woman spoke again. Did your father tell you why I'm here? Emma shook her head. My husband died on this very road, the woman said, her voice strangely calm. A drunk driver. When I came to the memorial ride, I wore his jacket. No one knew what to do with that. She gave a thin smile. I told them, if his legacy is here, then I'm here too. It took them 2 years to stop looking at me like an outsider. Emma stayed silent, unsure what to say. I didn't change anyone, the woman continued. I just kept showing up, day after day, until they understood I wasn't playing the role of someone in mourning. I was living with it. Emma looked toward the motorcycles lined up quietly under the early sun. For the first time, she understood. Being accepted wasn't a moment, it was a process. As the group prepared to ride again, a younger man passed by, glanced at Emma, and said in a dry voice, "We've got a lot of miles ahead." It wasn't a reminder, it was a test. Emma nodded, put her helmet back on, and climbed onto the bike. Her body still hurt. The fear was still there, but something had shifted. She no longer asked herself whether she belonged here. She only wondered whether she was persistent enough to keep going. That evening, the group stopped at a small roadside diner. Old fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over worn wooden tables, where the smell of lightly burnt coffee mixed with the scent of engine oil still clinging to their jackets. Emma sat down, her back still aching, but this time she didn't try to hide it. She placed her notebook on the table, not as a ticket asking for permission, but as a silent promise. If they spoke, she would listen. An older man sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee, trembling ever so slightly. He didn't look at Emma right away. He stared into the space between them, where memories often move more slowly than words. "You want to hear a real story?" he asked. Emma nodded. She didn't rush him. She didn't interrupt. He told her about the summer when he and his younger brother bought their first motorcycles together, a summer when everything still felt intact. 3 months later, a tire blew out on the highway, an unavoidable impact. Words left unsaid. He paused, took a deep breath. The coffee grew cold, but he didn't notice. "Your father found me 2 days later," the man said, sitting in the garage, holding the helmet. No one knew what to say. He didn't say anything, just sat there. Then came back the next day, and the day after that. Emma wrote very slowly, not because she was afraid of missing details, but because she understood. Every line she wrote carried weight. In the following table, her father sat with several other men. They spoke quietly, fragmented names, places that sounded like code, a language that existed only among people who had been through something that couldn't be explained to outsiders. Emma saw another version of her father, not the silent man at the kitchen table each night, but a man who was called by the correct name, understood without needing to explain himself. Then Ryan pulled a chair over and sat closer to Emma than necessary. Not threatening, but clearly a boundary was being tested. "Getting enough material for your paper?" he asked, biting hard into his food as if he wanted to swallow the question along with it. "Outsiders who write about us usually do one of two things: turn us into criminals or into a joke. Which one are you choosing?" Emma set her pen down. "Neither," she replied. "I'm trying to understand." "You can't understand," Ryan cut in. "You come, you take notes, you turn it in, you get your grade, then you leave." A second of silence stretched tight as a wire. "You're right," Emma said calmly. "I am an outsider. But my father gave his life to the people here. If I get this story wrong, I'm not just failing an assignment, I'm failing the people who gave me my father back." Ryan looked at her. For the first time, not with defensiveness, but with consideration. He turned away first. That night at the clubhouse, the sound of billiard balls rolling across the table mixed with low, muted laughter. Emma sat on a worn chair reviewing her notes. Her phone vibrated, a message asking if she was okay. She replied, "I'm fine." Then she looked out the window and saw her father on the phone, his shoulders tightening. A name was spoken softly, a name that had been absent for a very long time. Emma understood that she had just touched another layer of the story, a story of fractures that had never been repaired, and she knew that from this moment on, her project was no longer just documentation. It had become a key. Tommy returned on a weekday afternoon when the clubhouse was so quiet you could hear the second hand of the clock on the wall ticking. There was no laughter, no pool balls colliding. Just Emma, sitting alone, head bowed, transcribing interview notes, trying to keep her handwriting from blurring with exhaustion. She heard the sound of an unfamiliar motorcycle from the parking lot. Not loud, not familiar. A cautious sound, as if the rider himself was unsure whether he should be here. Through the window, Emma saw a middle-aged man step off the bike with a plain leather jacket, no patches. His movements were slow, his eyes scanning the building as if touching a memory that was both sacred and painful. He stopped at the door, placed his hand lightly on the old wooden frame, almost as if asking permission. Then he saw Emma. "Are you Emma?" he asked, his voice low but slightly unsteady. "I'm Tommy." The name, Emma had heard it before, not often, not clearly, but it was always followed by silence. She stood up, suddenly realizing she was alone with a stranger who didn't feel like one. "My dad said, you might call," she replied. Tommy smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I figured, after all these years, a phone call wouldn't be enough." The familiar sound of a truck pulled into the lot. Jack stepped out and froze when he saw the motorcycle. The moment stretched longer than a second, long enough for everything left unsaid over more than a decade to settle onto the shoulders of both men. The door opened. They stood a few steps apart. Neither offered a hand first. "It's been a long time," Jack said. "Yeah," Tommy replied. "It really has." They sat down. Coffee was poured. Safe words were placed on the table first, the way people probe for landmines. But the silence between them was no longer gentle. It was heavy with missed choices. News of Tommy's return spread quickly. One by one, people arrived, the hugs from the older members, the cautious looks from the younger ones. And then Ryan walked in. No small talk, no greeting. "I didn't think I'd ever see you here again," he said bluntly. "I didn't think I'd come back either," Tommy replied. "But there are things you carry your whole life if you don't face them." "My father died," Ryan said, his voice rigid. "And he died believing you had abandoned this club." The room sank into silence. Emma set her pen down. This was the fracture. At last, it had been named. Tommy didn't deny it. "I left because I believed we needed to change. Your father believed we needed to stay the same. We were both trying to protect the same thing." Jack spoke, very quietly. "And I stayed silent. I thought standing in the middle meant keeping the peace, but silence is also choosing a side." Tommy looked at Jack. There was no anger in his eyes, only sadness. "You were my best friend, and you didn't stand up." No one won in that moment. But for the first time in many years, the truth lay entirely on the table. Emma sat still. She understood this much. Some returns don't come with apologies, don't come with neat endings. They come carrying a question that was never answered. And that question was now forcing everyone to face it. The meeting that day did not end with reconciliation. There was no long handshake. No one said, "Everything will be fine." Only a heavy silence that lingered after the door closed. Ryan left first. He didn't say another word, just put on his helmet, started the engine, and shot straight down the road ahead, as if he needed wind and speed to keep himself from breaking apart right then. The sound of his bike faded, leaving behind a hollow space no one knew how to fill. Inside the clubhouse, people drifted into small groups. No one had the energy for small talk. Old stories, usually told with tired smiles, stayed lodged in their throats. Emma sat beside Maria. The woman wiped her eyes quickly as if she didn't want anyone to notice. "You made them reopen things they tried to close," Maria said softly. No accusation, no praise, just the truth. Emma didn't know whether to apologize or to say thank you. In the end, she said nothing. That evening, after most people had gone home, Emma passed by the garage in the back. The door was ajar. Warm yellow light spilled out, casting two familiar shadows. Jack and Tommy stood in front of an old motorcycle, a Sportster that had been sitting idle for months. There was no repair plan, no checklist. They just started. One man handed over a wrench, the other took it. No words needed. They stood closer than Emma had expected. The awkward movements at first gradually grew synchronized, as if their bodies remembered better than their minds. 15 years apart hadn't been enough to erase something that had been repeated thousands of times. Jack said something very quietly. Tommy laughed, a real laugh, unforced. Then Jack lowered his head. His shoulders trembled. Emma stood at the doorway. She didn't step inside, and she didn't take notes. Some moments, once turned into words, lose their meaning. In that moment, Emma understood something she had previously only written on paper. Legacy doesn't live in carefully preserved symbols. It lives in the small actions people are willing to do again, together. Outside, Ryan sat on his bike. His helmet rested in his hands, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. Emma walked over slowly. "You don't have to turn him into the villain to hold on to your pain," she said gently. "Sometimes, holding on to anger isn't the only way to remember your father." Ryan didn't look at her right away. After a moment, he exhaled. "My father spent his last years bitter," he said. "I thought that if I held on to that anger, I was being loyal to him." Emma nodded. "Maybe loyalty is sometimes learning how to let go." Ryan turned to look at her. For the first time, not with guardedness. "You're tougher than you look," he said. "When the project's done, I want to read it." Emma smiled. "I'll give you the full version." Ryan started the engine. Before leaving, he paused for a beat, said nothing more, then disappeared into the night. Emma turned back toward the garage. The bike coughed softly, then roared to life. Not because it was perfect, but because it had been touched in the right place. And she realized, some legacies aren't passed down through promises, but through the courage to stay, to repair, and to move forward together. That year's memorial ride did not take place on the familiar date as it did every year. Not because anyone forgot, but because Jack said, if we keep waiting for everything to be perfect, we'll never do it. The morning began very early. The air was still veiled in mist, yet the lights inside the clubhouse were already on. One by one, motorcycles rolled into the parking lot, lining up in a formation longer than Emma had ever seen. The sound of their engines blended, not loud but low and steady, like the heartbeat of a community that had learned how to breathe together. Emma stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. She was no longer an observer, standing on the edge, but she didn't dare think she entirely belonged either. That feeling, being in between, was both fragile and sacred. Maria called Emma into the back room. On the old wooden table, Jack's leather jacket lay neatly folded. Not a new one. The one that had carried him across thousands of miles, through winters that stiffened his grip on the handlebars, through rides known only to him and the road itself. Jack entered last. He stood across from Emma, his gaze calmer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about holding on and about letting go." Emma shook her head instinctively. "Dad, you don't have to." Jack raised his hand, not to stop her, but to ask her to listen. Legacy isn't something you lock away in a glass case, he said. It lives when someone dares to carry it forward. Maria opened a small sewing kit. No one spoke after that. The needle passed through leather, slowly, steadily, with practiced hands. Beneath Jack's faded name, a new name gradually appeared. Not larger, not bolder, just alongside it. Emma felt her chest tighten. The ride back no longer carried the rhythm of the morning. No one twisted the throttle without thinking. No one joked over the intercom. The motorcycles followed one another in a quiet line, as if each rider was carrying a piece of memory that had just been named. When the clubhouse parking lot came into view, no one hurried to get off their bikes. Engines shut down one by one, leaving a space wide enough for thoughts to slip in. Emma removed her helmet and took a deep breath. The late afternoon air carried the familiar scent of engine oil, the smell of long days and stories that were never fully told. People stayed longer than usual. Someone brewed another pot of coffee. Someone leaned against a bike, telling a short story with no beginning and no end. No one tried to wrap things up, because everyone understood. There are things that, if closed too quickly, become dishonest. Ryan walked over to Emma. There was no longer a defensive distance in his eyes, only the exhaustion that comes after setting a heavy burden down. "When will you be finished?" he asked. "Probably not for a while," Emma replied. "Some parts can't be written quickly." Ryan nodded. "When it's done, I want to read it. All of it." Emma smiled. Not a smile of victory, but the smile of someone who understands that being trusted is a responsibility, not a reward. At the edge of the lot, Jack and Tommy stood beside each other. They didn't say much, just exchanged a nod. Then two Harleys roared to life at the same time. No appointment needed, no explanations. Two old friends rode side by side, their wheels rolling along the road that had once divided them. Emma watched until their taillights melted into the sunset. That night, she sat at her computer. The document was open, tens of thousands of words. She reread the early sections where she had stood on the outside, trying to maintain the distance of an observer. Then the later pages, where the voice slowed down, grew, deeper, more careful. She changed the title. Nothing ornate, no explanation, just 3 words. Brotherhood. A legacy in motion. Outside, the sound of an engine rose once more, not to draw attention, to confirm that the road was still there and that someone was still riding on it. Emma saved the file, closed the laptop, touched the patch on the back of her jacket where 2 names lay side by side, not overlapping. She understood something that it had taken her a long time to learn. Legacy isn't something you receive when someone leaves. It's something you are invited to carry when you are brave enough not to turn back. Some journeys don't need an ending. They only need people willing to keep going, slowly, honestly, and without leaving one another behind. Some stories don't end when the road does. They remain in the way people walk more slowly, speak less, and listen more. Emma understood that late one night when the clubhouse lights were off. There was no laughter, no smell of hot coffee, only the scent of old leather, engine oil, and a quiet that once frightened her. Now it didn't. That quiet felt like an acknowledgement. Everyone here had been through enough that nothing more needed to be said. She stood alone, her hand resting on the patch on the back of her jacket. 2 names lay side by side. Neither is larger than the other, neither overshadowing the other. And she realized, legacy isn't about standing up to replace someone. It's about walking alongside what already exists, with enough respect not to erase it and enough courage to continue. The men here were the same. They didn't become different people after the memorial. No one was healed by a single speech or a handshake. But something had shifted. Just slightly, just enough to make tomorrow look different from yesterday. Ryan still carried the grief of his father. Jack still had sleepless nights. Tommy still bore the regret of years spent on a different path. But now, they no longer had to carry those things alone. And sometimes, simply not having to take something alone is salvation. Emma opened her manuscript one last time. She didn't edit anything further. She didn't try to make the story feel complete because life is rarely full. She left the gaps, the quiet spaces, places where readers could fill in the story with their own. She remembered the first moment she stepped into that room, the sense of not belonging, the skeptical looks, the laughter, not cruel but sharp enough. If she had turned away then, none of this would have happened. Not because she was special, but because there are doors that only open when you're patient enough to stand before them. The road ahead is still long. There are still sharp turns. There are still losses that can't be avoided. But now, Emma knows she isn't walking alone, and those who once believed she didn't belong have learned something too. Sometimes, the person who carries a legacy forward doesn't look the way we expect. The story ends there, not with a complete stop, but with a silence deep enough for a question to echo in every heart. Are you preserving your legacy, or are you letting it live? If this story made you pause for a moment, if you saw somewhere within it a reflection of yourself, an unspoken silence, an unfinished road, or a legacy waiting to be continued, leave a comment. We read every line as we read real lives. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories of people, memories, and journeys that never truly end, please like, share, and subscribe to Deep Life Tales. Because sometimes, the only thing we need is the story honest enough to remind us to keep going.